Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the webinar. So this morning, we're launching the use of pornography by young adults in Ireland. So this is a report that has been authored by the ESRI, but commissioned by the HSE. So in a couple of moments, I'm going to call on Orla McGowan from the HSE, who will provide a little bit more context for the report and the issue we're generally discussing today. Then after that, the report on the authors, my colleague Nolan, will take you through a detailed presentation on the results. Now, as we always do with these sort of events, in addition to having a sort of a research perspective, we're always eager to have a perspective too from policymakers and practitioners, and I'm delighted to say that we've got a really good panel. I'll introduce the folks to you later on when we get these additional insights on the issue that we're discussing this morning. Towards the end of the webinar, hopefully we'll have a little bit of time for questions and answers. I'd ask you, as the presentation of the results is happening, if you sort of think of questions and start jotting them down in the Q&A function, and I'll try and play that role then towards the end of the webinar of communicating the questions essentially to Anne and Emer primarily, and it should be a very interesting and engaging morning. So with that, delighted to welcome Orla McGowan from the Sexual Health and Crisis Pregnancy Programme in the HSE. You're very welcome to, I'd normally be welcome you to the ESRI proper, Orla, but you're very welcome to the webinar. Great to have you here. Great to be able to thank the HSE for their engagement on this very, very important and let's be honest, to a sort of a sensitive and a kind of a tricky area of research. But I just want to congratulate you and your colleagues for commissioning the work and engaging with the topic in the way that you have. So with that, I'll hand over to you, Orla.
Thank you, Alan. Good morning, everybody. I thought it might be useful to provide an overview and some context to this piece of research. As many of you are aware, the HSE Sexual Health and Crisis Pregnancy Programme has a long-standing commitment to research. We recognise the great value of the Growing Up in Ireland dataset and commissioned the RSI to analyse the data from the 1998 cohort across 3 topics related to sexual health. The first one is today, the use of pornography among young people, sexual initiation and sexual health behaviours, and those reports will be published later in the year. We know, of course, from previous research that young people are viewing pornography, but in saying that, research in the Irish context on the use of pornography among young people has been limited. This research supports our work providing up-to-date data from the Irish context. Questions that we were interested in were: what proportion of young men and young women are using pornography? Does viewing pornography have an impact on safer sex practices, and to what extent? And is viewing pornography linked to any other behavioural outcome? And I'll leave it to the research team to take us through the findings. While these are among the first national sets of research findings about pornography use among young people in Ireland, we know, of course, that anecdotally, youth workers, parents and teachers have been raising these concerns over the last few years. We already provide funding to the National Youth Council of Ireland to run a training course for youth workers on how to address pornography use among young people. And thanks to Kevin O'Driscoll for joining us today to discuss his experience of that. Pornography use has also featured in the review of the Relationships and Sexuality Education Programme in post-primary schools and the development of the new Social, Personal and Health Education curriculum for junior cycle. And thanks to Mella Cusack from the NCCA here with us today to give us more detail on that. My colleague Moira Germaine, who is also on the panel today, will talk about the importance of parents talking with their children about relationships and sexuality issues, including about the possible impacts of pornography use. And she will outline the supports that the HSE offers in this regard. So finally, I just want to say a warm thank you to Professors Anne Nolan and Emer Smith, Alan Barrett and the wider team in the ESRI for their work with us on this research and today's event. I'd also like to thank the steering group and my own colleagues, Dr. Aideen Butler, Moira Germaine, Caoimhe McClafferty and Fiona Murphy for their work on this project. Back to you, Alan.
Great, thank you so much, Orla. Really appreciate that. So, with that, I'm going to hand over now to my colleague Anne Nolan. So, I think again, as you all know, Anne and colleague Emer Smith have been the authors of this report. So, Anne, I think is going to do all the speaking today. Emer will be available for the questions later. So, over to you, Anne, and your screen is sharing nicely there. So, we're all set.
Great. Thanks very much, Alan, and good morning, everybody. And thank you to Orla and colleagues at the HSE for that really good overview, I think, of where we're coming from with this piece of research. So this is joint work with my colleague, Emer Smith, who will be joining us later for the questions session. So I suppose just to give you a bit of background on why this area is important and why it's worthy of research. We all know that with widespread internet access and mobile phone use, pornography has become increasingly available, affordable, and easier to access anonymously. And the sort of research and policy literature, if you read it, there's really sort of wide variation in the prevalence of pornography use among adolescents and young adults. And to some extent, that's not surprising. The way in which this data are collected varies a lot, across countries, across the type of survey or data collection method that's used, how pornography is defined in terms of the questionnaires, how people perceive pornography and answering those questions. But in Ireland, there is some existing data on the prevalence of pornography use in sort of older adolescents. So a survey that was carried out in 2018, the My World 2 survey of senior cycle students, so students in 4th, 5th, 6th year in secondary school, found that 86% of young men and 24% of young women had ever watched pornography. And why might we be worried about this, or why is this a sort of a concern for policymakers and practitioners in terms of pornography use? And I suppose there's a number of reasons why that might be the case. The first is that young people, because of their age and their experience, they lack the media literacy and sort of broader life experience to critically evaluate the content that they see when they watch pornography. I suppose the way in which relationships and sexual relationships are portrayed in pornography can promote gender imbalance in their own sort of subsequent sexual and wider relationships. It can lead to risky sexual health behaviours, the way in which, for example, relationships are portrayed, often condoms are not used, and we'll get onto that a little bit later. And then I suppose the sort of idealised nature of the relationships can impact on self-esteem, body image, and broader well-being. So previous literature in this area, there's been a couple of systematic reviews of pornography use, mainly in adolescents, has noted that most previous research is focused on the sort of individual level factors, so things like age and sex and sort of family background that lead or that are associated with pornography use in young people. And there's been comparatively little research on the sort of broader contextual factors. So things like the sort of family relationships, peer networks, sort of broader environmental factors that might be associated with pornography use. And also, I suppose, in the context of online pornography use, the sort of pull factors. So things like how young people use the internet more broadly, whether the internet and devices are available to them, and the extent to which monitoring of that behaviour takes place in the home or at school. And there's also a growing evidence base as well then on what's sort of termed the consequences of pornography use. So, does watching pornography lead to various different types of outcomes? And there's sort of two main groups that have been the focus of the research so far, and we'll delve into these a little bit ourselves later on. So first of all, there's a focus, I suppose, on the sexual health behaviours, beliefs and attitudes that may sort of derive from people watching pornography. And then secondly, the sort of consequences for broader mental health and well-being. I suppose with these issues and sort of looking at what are broadly termed the consequences of pornography use, it can be difficult to sort of unpick the causality here. And what I mean there is, in which direction that association works. So does pornography use lead to sort of riskier sexual health behaviors, or is there something else that's sort of underlying that association? Maybe people that are just generally more risk averse engage in riskier sexual health behaviors and are also more likely to watch pornography. So, these are quite important issues to tease out for policymakers. So the research questions then that we examine in this piece of research and that are in the sort of broader report that's published today are, firstly, what are the risk and protective factors that are associated with use of pornography at the age of 20? So I'll come on to that in a moment, why we're looking at the age of 20. And we look at a variety of factors. So not only the sort of individual level factors that I mentioned earlier, but also because of the comprehensiveness of the Growing Up in Ireland data, which is what we use, we have information on peer networks, on the family context, also on where they've had where they get their information on sex and relationships, how they use the internet, and also their post-education pathways. And then secondly, we look at how pornography use at the age of 20 sort of interacts with sexual health behaviours, also measured at the age of 20. And then finally, look at how pornography use at age 20 is associated with mental health and well-being, also measured at the age of 20. So the data that we use is from the Growing Up in Ireland study, and we're very grateful to both the Central Statistics Office and the Department of Children, Equality, Disability, Integration and Youth for giving us access to these data. So the main source of data that we're using is from wave 4 of the 1998 cohort of Growing Up in Ireland. And this was collected when these young people were aged broadly around the age of 20 in 2018. Some were surveyed in 2019. So it's 5 or so years ago now. And information on pornography use was collected as part of a self-completion questionnaire. So obviously with information of this type, which is a potentially sensitive issue, we're not asking people directly face-to-face whether they use pornography. We get people to fill out a self-completion questionnaire on a laptop. So, their information is anonymous and they do it in their own sort of privacy. And it's collected as part of a broader module on internet and technology use in Growing Up in Ireland. Growing Up in Ireland is a longitudinal study, so we have information on sort of individual characteristics, on family background, on sort of family functioning at earlier ages as well, so right back to the age of 9. And we do use some of that information, as you'll see as I go along. And the final sample size that we have is about 4,500 young people who were observed in all 4 waves, so right from the age of 9. You'll see, and you've probably heard some of the reporting this morning around the difference in prevalence of pornography use between young men and women. So in all of the analyses that I'm going to show you, we separate the models for males and females because the patterns are so different. And these are pretty much cross-sectional analysis. So we're looking at pornography use at the age of 20. So as I mentioned earlier, there can be caveats over the sort of the direction of the association here, particularly for the analysis of the well-being outcomes. So the question that we use to derive the information on pornography use is derived from a question, as I mentioned, on internet use. So young people are asked, do you use the internet for the following? And they're given up to 16 different options, so different ways in which they use the internet. So you'll see here from the chart that, they can tick as many of these as they want. So, do you use the internet for social media, for messaging, for watching, listening to music, for gaming, gambling, and one of the options is pornography. So you can see there that overall across the sample, so both young men and women, just under 40% report that they use the internet for pornography. But there's obviously, and this is consistent with other research, there's a big difference between, and statistically significant difference between males and females. So 64% of males report that they use the internet for pornography and 13% of females. There's also differences in terms of the other uses of the internet as well between males and females. So males in general are more intensive users of the internet, so they tick more of these options than females do. And with the exception of, if I can remember this now, social media, online shopping, and online job applications, males also have higher prevalence of these other uses. So anything with a star is where males are more intensive users of the internet for this reason than females. So what I'm going to show you in the next few slides are the results of our statistical models, where we try and sort of unpick the factors that are associated with pornography use at the age of 20. So as I mentioned, there are separate models for males and females. So you can see that in the columns here. And along the left-hand side, then we have sort of the main individual level sort of correlates of pornography use. And this was, I suppose, mainly motivated by the sort of previous literature and sort of theoretical models around what might predict pornography use. So first of all, there's relatively little association with age. This is primarily due to the fact that most of the cohort at the age were 20 when they were surveyed in 2018. There were some that were 19 and some that were 21. But in general, there's no association. A slight positive association with age for males, but it's only of borderline statistical significance. A really strong finding is that those that are gay or bisexual are significantly more likely to use pornography, particularly among young women. That size is particularly large there. We find an interesting difference in the predictors for males and females depending on the sort of social background of the young person. So males from sort of more advantaged backgrounds are more likely to use online pornography, significantly so, but there's no association or no statistically significant association for young women. In general, the sort of other characteristics like lone parent, migrant background, having a special education need, and growing up in an urban or rural area are largely non-significant. The only one really where there's statistical significance is young men who grow up in lone parent households are significantly less likely to use pornography. There's quite a bit of literature around the effect of early puberty, and the literature tends to show that those who go through puberty earlier are more likely to use pornography. We don't have a great measure of early puberty, particularly for males, in the Growing Up in Ireland study, and we find no association there. And really, when we include other factors, we don't find an association for females either. One interesting finding, and again, this sort of correlates with the international research, is in terms of the gender mix of older siblings. So compared with those that don't have any older siblings, so they are the eldest in their own family, females that have all female older siblings are significantly less likely to use pornography. And a really strong finding, and this is statistically significant in all the models that we use, is the effect of sort of religious practice and religious identification. So compared to those who say they have a religion and that they practice frequently, those that have either no religion or have a religion but practice infrequently are significantly more likely to use pornography. So the next set of slides then, what I'm going to show you are sort of successive models where we add sort of blocks of factors to that initial model that I showed you the results from, where we get at some of these sort of broader contextual factors that might be associated with pornography use. So the first set of factors we look at are sex education and where young people are getting their information about sex. So obviously there's a number of different ways in which young people receive information about sex. So obviously there's the sort of formal sex education, and we'll hear a little bit more about that later in the panel discussion. So the relationship and sexuality education curriculum. They can also, tell us themselves. So the main source of information on sex is where we ask young people at the age of 13 and 17, what's their main source of information on sex? Is it your parents? Is it your friends? Is it the internet or books? Is it your teacher? Or you don't have any source at all? And then we also ask parents themselves about whether they've spoken to their child about sex and relationships, and what sort of topics, if they have, what sort of topics have they broached with them. And really we find no real association between the timing of relationship and sexuality education in growing up in Ireland and pornography use at the age of 20. So we know if young people have received RSE by the age of 13, by the age of 17, or not at all. The vast majority have received some RSE by the age of 17. But unfortunately, in growing up in Ireland, we don't know the sort of frequency of that. We don't know anything about the content or the quality of that instruction. So it's a relatively crude indicator of RSE receipt. However, what we do find is a really strong association, particularly for males, between where they are sourcing their information on sex at sort of earlier ages, so at 13 and 17, and their subsequent use of pornography. So young males who at the age of 13 said that they sourced most of their information from the internet or from their friends as opposed to their parents, were much more likely to use pornography at the age of 20. And similarly for females then at the age of 17. Now, obviously, we don't have a measure. We don't have the same measure of pornography use at earlier ages in growing up in Ireland, but we suspect that those who said that they use the internet as their main source of information on sex at the age of 13 and 17 may have been accessing pornography. Interestingly, from the sort of perspective of the parents, we don't find any association between, the timing of when they talk to their children about sex and or the types of topics that they broached. But it's worth noting that pornography was not one of the topics, the 5 topics that was mentioned in the Growing Up in Ireland study. Next, we look at peer factors. So again, there's quite a lot of literature, and if you think about adolescence, the peer network starts to become much more important in terms of influencing their behaviours. So really, what we find here is very little association once we have controlled for other factors. So in contrast with the sort of the age or the sex profile of siblings, we don't really find much of an association here, with a sort of with the exception of a bit of an association between males who feel alienated from their friends are subsequently more likely to use pornography. In terms of sort of parental and family monitoring factors, we do find some suggestion here that sort of more monitoring in earlier adolescence is associated with less pornography use at the age of 20. So for males, those whose internet use was monitored at the age of 13, they're less likely to use pornography at the age of 20. And kind of a similar measure for females, those that were allowed to spend more time home alone at the age of 13, they're more likely to use pornography. One thing that comes out quite strongly in the literature is the sort of the availability, but also the opportunity for young people to access pornography. And one aspect of that is, how much privacy they have in their own home. We find only an effect for females here. So for females who share a bedroom at the age of 17, they're less likely to access pornography. And then finally, in terms of these sort of blocks of factors, we look at education and sort of post-school pathway factors. So one hypothesis I think that many of us had was that the type of school, so whether the school was single sex or mixed in terms of gender, would make a difference in terms of pornography use, but we find no association here. We find sort of consistent with the finding in relation to the social background of young men. So men from more advantaged backgrounds are more likely to use pornography. We find a strong association between leaving cert grades and pornography use among males, but that's essentially picking up that advantage effect. We do find an association here between females who relative to those who are in sort of university or third level, those that go on to further education are less likely to use pornography It's a really sort of strong and consistent finding, but we are sort of unsure about how to interpret that. And for males, we find that those who regard school as sort of helping them in preparing for adult life, so sort of more positive perception of their schooling, are less likely to use pornography at the age of 20. So the next couple of slides then, I'm going to take you through the results of sort of the second and third research questions. So this set of models that I'm looking at here, again, we're looking separately at males and females. And on the left-hand side here, I have various different sort of outcomes or sexual health behaviours. And what I'm looking at here is whether pornography use is associated with each of these 5 different outcomes. So the first one we look at is age of sexual initiation. In growing up in Ireland, we don't ask directly at what age people first had sex, but we do ask at the age of 17 whether they've had sex, and then subsequently at the age of 20 whether they've had sex. So we can sort of construct a measure which broadly sort of characterizes sort of earlier versus later or not yet sexual initiation. There's obvious issues here around the sort of the direction of the association, but we find that those who use pornography at the age of 20, they're more likely to have initiated sex at an earlier age. We don't find any association between pornography use and the perception of timing of first sex. So there's a bit of evidence in the literature that those who use pornography may sort of regret the timing of their first sex in the sense that they feel it happened too soon. And for females, we find an association with the number of partners in the last year. One thing that came out very strongly from these models was this very strong association between using pornography at the age of 20 and being significantly less likely to regularly use condoms, so to use condoms whenever they have sex. And this was the case for both males and females. We might get onto that at the end. And then finally, we look at various sort of consequences in terms of broader sort of well-being outcomes for young people. So again, we have separate models here for males and females. And what I'm showing you are the results for 5 different outcomes. So depression or depressive symptoms, a sense of life satisfaction, self-image, aggression, and using negative coping strategies to deal with stressful situations. And in general here, the association is between pornography use at the age of 20 and poorer well-being on each of these measures. So for males in particular, we find that those that use pornography are more likely to report depressive symptoms at the age of 20. And this is even taking into account the fact that, or their measure of depressive symptoms at the age of 17. For females, that's not the case, that once we take into account their prior measure of depressive symptoms, we don't see that association at the age of 20. Similarly, for males, then we find that those that use pornography are less satisfied with their lives. And again, that finding is robust even when we take account of earlier measures of life satisfaction. For males, we find, again, another association between between pornography use and lower levels of self-image at age 20. But this is sort of mediated by the prior measure of self-image. For both males and females, those that use pornography are more likely to display aggression, and for males in particular, they're more likely to use negative coping strategies to deal with stressful situations. But I suppose it's worth again emphasizing here that because we don't have sort of earlier measures of pornography use, it's hard to really unpack the direction of causality here. So, you could argue in one sense, pornography use because of the content that people are seeing that leads to poorer self-image. But it could also be the case that those who have poorer self-image are seeking out pornography, and it's a sort of a self-perpetuating cycle. So there needs to be, I think, a little bit of caution and taken in interpreting the results from these models. So in terms of the summary of the main findings, we find strong gendered patterns in use of pornography at the age of 20, very consistent with previous research and other international statistics. And we do find heterogeneity or differences in the individual and broader contextual correlates of pornography use. So probably the most striking is we find that men from more advantaged backgrounds are more likely to use pornography, but we don't find that association for women. Across both males and females, use is responsive rather than response to rule setting. So in terms of sort of religiosity, internet monitoring for males at the age of 13, time spent home alone at the age of 13 for females. We don't find any sort of relationship with school-based RSE, but as I mentioned, the measure in growing up in Ireland is just simply whether you have received it, nothing about the frequency or the content. But internet, and to a lesser extent, friends as a source of information on sex at earlier ages is very important. In terms of the sort of wider consequences then of pornography use is related to earlier timing of sexual initiation, and particularly to lower levels of condom use. And we do find associations with poorer well-being, particularly for young men. Okay, so in terms of the policy implications, I suppose there's a number of points to emphasize here, and hopefully we might get into some of these in the panel discussion, but also I think in the broader discussion and questions and answers at the end. So the first thing to note is that this sort of gender difference that we see both in the prevalence of pornography use, but also in some of the correlates associated with pornography use, does create challenges, I think, for policymakers and also for practitioners in sort of targeting particular population groups. We do find that LGBTQ youth are much more likely to be using pornography, and there's a bit of discussion in the sort of research and policy literature that this may be young people using it as a source of information in sex in the absence of seeing what they need to know reflected in sort of formal and informal sex education. I suppose what the results definitely show in terms of the main source of information in sex is the importance of both formal and informal sex education. So number one, that sort of really strong finding around internet and friends as a main source of information on sex being more predictive of pornography use than among those who talk to their parents about sex, suggests that we need, more and better supports for parents in talking to their children about pornography. And it'll be really interesting to hear about the revised social, personal and health education curriculum at primary and particularly at post-primary level. The findings then in relation to pornography use and lower use of condoms, I suppose, highlight the importance of messages and public health messages around safe sex, not only in terms of preventing sexually transmitted infections, but also in terms of unplanned pregnancies. And then the sort of the final set of results in relation to mental health and well-being, I suppose they, in some sense, encompass the importance of the well-being sort of framework within schools, to focus on not only on sort of well-being, but also on sort of broader issues like pornography use and media and digital literacy more generally. And one thing as well, I think, which was obvious from doing this research is that, at the age of 20, these young people are sort of diverging in terms of their post-education pathways. When we did some research at younger ages in terms of where young people are getting information on sex, at the age of 17, the vast majority of them are still in school. So in that sense, targeting them is easier as a group. But as they move into different pathways, some go into work, some go to university, some go on to sort of post or further education, it becomes a little bit more difficult to sort of target resources towards them. So we would highlight, I think, the importance of recognizing the different pathways that these young people are on at this age. So I will leave it there and hand over to Alan again.
Great, thank you so much, Anne. Fascinating report and very well delivered there. So sincere thanks for that. Okay, so we're going to move on to the next stage of the morning. Actually, before I do, I should say there's over 100 people online at the moment. So clearly a great deal of interest in the topic. So I want to introduce you now to our panel. As we said earlier on, always eager to make sure we have a good blend of the research on the one hand, both practitioners and policymakers. So joined by three people, and I'll just read out a small amount on each. So firstly, let me introduce Moira Germaine. So Moira is the Education and Training Manager with the HSE Sexual Health and Crisis Pregnancy Programme and has over 20 years experience of sexual health promotion. She was formerly a Senior Health Promotion Officer. She's also been a Community Development Officer with a focus on mitigating educational disadvantage, and Moira was also a post-primary teacher. So Moira, delighted to have you. Second panelist then is Mella Cusack. So Mella is an education officer with the National Council for Curriculum and Assessment, the NCCA. Mella has worked with the group who developed the Junior Cycle Social, Personal and Health Education. That's the SPHE short course, which was published in 2023, and currently working on a revision of Senior Cycle SPHE. So Mella has an interest in and experience of producing curriculum materials dealing with emotive, sensitive and controversial issues and topics. So Mella, you're very welcome too. And then last but not least, Kevin O'Driscoll. So Kevin has had 14 years experience in various youth work roles. Since 2021, Kevin's the Health Promotion Officer with the National Youth Council of Ireland in the National Youth Health Programme. And in this role, he works with youth work and out of education sector to develop its capacity to promote young people's health, particularly mental and sexual health. So three people who are ideally well placed to talk about our topic today. So we're going to have sort of two rounds of comments, if we can do that. And in the first instance, I'm going to ask the folks almost to sort of develop on some of the themes that Anne was talking about there, and to get a sense of what various groups of people are saying about this issue and communicating to the folks. So that'll be the first stage. And then in the second sort of run through, I'm going to get each of the colleagues to talk a little bit more focused ways about what their organizations are doing specifically in that area. So Mella, if I can start with you, made aware that you completed a consultation process with young people recently, which has sort of covered some of the topics. So it would be really fascinating to hear from you, like what have you learned from young people about what they're saying about pornography, and in a sense of what they need to know. So over to you, Mella.
Thanks so much, Alan. Yeah, so young people have told us that they can encounter pornography either accidentally while they're looking for information about relationships and sexuality, or they can be encountering it because they're being shown it by their peers. And this can happen really from any time that children get their first device, so usually their smartphone. And that obviously is echoing what we've heard from Anne in terms of the GUI report and some of the other research literature that was actually reviewed in the GUI report. And the young people that we spoke to in recent junior cycle consultations, they told us that they wanted to understand the influence of pornography and the influence that it can have on their lives. So the result of that feedback, as well as the feedback that we received from a range of other stakeholders, and having looked at that research evidence, led to the inclusion of what we would call a learning outcome in the revised junior cycle SPHE curriculum. So if you don't mind, I'm just going to read that learning outcome out for you, because I think it's really useful to know and to use the exact wording. So it's that students should be able to discuss the influence of popular culture and the online world, in particular the influence of pornography on young people's understanding, expectations and social norms in relation to sexual expression. And more recently, again, we've been doing consultations with young people around senior cycle SPHE, and we heard the same thing. They're saying that they need to be facilitated to discuss the influence of pornography on their sexual expectations and behaviours. But interestingly, they also want to know where to go for support if they've been impacted or if somebody is impacted by pornography.
So thanks for that, Mella, and we will come back to you in a couple of moments. But Kevin, if we can go to you next, and it would be interesting to get the sort of the perspective of your colleagues in the youth work sector. Again, what are they saying about this topic that again further illuminates what we're hearing today?
Yeah, thanks, Alan. I suppose what we're hearing in the youth sector very much mirrors what has come up in the report, and I suppose we really value the open discussion and what this might promote, because the secrecy and taboo around the topic maybe exacerbates what's going on for young people and kind of makes it more problematic. So a couple of things that come up, and there'll be a bit of replication. So like the ease of access in terms of what young people are so easily able to access pornography. And this kind of promotes it then as the primary source of information around sexual activity and relationships and stuff like that. And that's problematic in the sense then that young people don't have context or knowledge of the porn industry. So they're taking what they see as read and kind of see those behaviours as normal or acceptable. So that leads on to problematic behaviours then, in the sense that particularly young males have unrealistic expectations around what sexual encounters should look like. So that leads to them engaging behaviour that might be abusive or might be physical towards partners. And then the problem comes that females see this behaviour as the norm as well, and are accepting of behaviours that you wouldn't ordinarily expect them to be. So again, that causes problems there. We've seen a high kind of worry about an increase in coercive behaviour. So people being pressured into doing things that they don't want to do. And there's an evidence base that suggests that a young person that engages in their first sexual activity, and if they regret that activity, then that leads to diminished kind of sexual well-being throughout their life cycle. So there's obvious problems there. And another problem in terms of peer pressure and being pressured into things is the sharing of images, explicit images. So there's two consequences there. There's the personal fallout of an image being shared or leaked, and then there's the legal implication for the young people involved. Again, the increase in risky behaviour, such as not using condoms and other things like that. We can see a rise in STIs in the younger age group, and so they're being replicated, and that's a worry that youth workers are seeing. And then I suppose the last thing we see is that the survey says that it's predominantly a male activity, and what we are seeing at trainings is predominantly females attending our trainings. So we're just wondering where the open spaces for males to sit down and have the discussion with young males is, if they're not coming to engage in the topic themselves. So that would be a worry for the sector as well.
Great, thanks for that, Kevin. And again, we will come back to you. Actually, I mean, just from the two contributions so far, there's a real sense of, I think, fear and nervousness, which at least is positive in the sense that, there seems to be an awareness of some of the troubling trends. Moira, I want to come to you next, and I was hoping that you could talk to us about sort of the role of parents and how parents are coping with this, because again, I think every parent either logged in here or just generally this is just an issue that kind of terrifies us all. So yeah, any advice? What's happening?
Well, indeed it does, Alan. And thank you very much to you and to Anne and Emer there. I suppose one of the questions is, this is big and daunting, so why should parents bother? If it's if it's happening in the school and the youth work sector, maybe parents should leave it to them. But I think what is really clear from the research previously, from some of the work that my colleagues have done on parent-child communication, both national and international research, and from the ESRI's former 2020 research, is that parents really, really matter. If we're in the business, which I hope we are, of promoting this positive, healthy approach to relationships and sexuality, which is part of young people's overall cognitive, physical, social, emotional development, then parents cannot be left or leave themselves out of the equation. So I'm listening to Kevin and Mella and to the findings of the report. I mean, the reason why trusted adults have actually to be there for young people is just absolutely obvious and manifest. And I mean, even that finding that young people whose I suppose source of RSE is primarily their friends or the internet rather than their parents, that they have higher levels of pornography use. And then to see the association between higher levels of pornography use and, poor overall well-being and lower condom use, they're just indicators of some of the impacts that can happen when we as adults and we as parents, don't take on this role. Now, just to say, the HSE isn't advocating that parents out of the blue start talking to their children about pornography. You can imagine what a reception that might get. But what we are saying that in the best scenario, parents from the very, very earliest years, should be talking to their children and then their preteens and then their adolescents about all aspects of relationships and sexuality in an age-appropriate way. Starting with the very earliest years when you're talking about friendships and family relationships and bodies and how to take care of yourself and safety, all those kind of things that are relevant to that life stage, moving on to puberty and things of early adolescence. And then in the mid-teen years and the later young adult years, talking about sexual activity, talking about sexual relationships, and including talking about respectful, healthy sexual relationships, consent, gender scripts, all the things that might have an impact on people's attitudes and behaviors in terms of their relationships with other people. So I suppose it does make it easier if you can start with all these micro conversations and work your way through. But, even in the adolescent years, before you ever get to the subject of pornography, there are so many ways you can have a conversation with your young adult about healthy relationships. Taking all the cues from music, gaming, if you're an adult gamer, parent gamer, but even if, the things that your kids are interested in, there are just loads of cues to actually talk about healthy, respectful, mutually pleasurable sexual relationships in adult life. And, it's against this background that then perhaps you can move on to talk about pornography. And the findings of this research, some of these might be really nice cues to actually begin those conversations. So I suppose, just to conclude, that young people will never learn about healthy relationships from pornography. That's our job. Our job is to give them that solid grounding in real life so that they will have something against which to judge all those external, sources of information that are coming at them. And yes, it is daunting. The conversation can be embarrassing, all those things. And there are loads of conversations in life that are embarrassing and still worth it. And I would say, as a last thing, that as a parent, it gets easier with practice. Talking about relationships and sexuality, even the most sensitive and tricky things, including pornography, does get easier at practice.
Okay, thanks for that, Moira. We could pick up the theme of whether or not this gets easier. I always think one of the problems of being a parent, though, is the way you only get one or two goes at it. I'm from a family of 6, so maybe my parents were luckier. By the time I came along as number 5, they'd got a lot of practice, so they might have known what they were doing. But it's such a difficult one. I said earlier on that we would take a second run through the panel, and that we were talking a little bit more of a focused way then about the sort of actions your organizations are taking to deal with this. So I'm going to put that question to each of you, but to the extent you've touched on some of these issues already. So if you want, you can say what your organizations are doing, but you can also feel free to say what you wish your organizations were doing. Okay, really sort of in terms of what should be the really grand ambition here. And I'm sure you've got insights into what you really want to be doing. So Kevin, do you want to kick off with that one? What's happening, but what would you like to see happen?
Yeah, no problem. As Orla outlined at the beginning, so we're funded by the Sexual Health and Crisis Pregnancy Programme to deliver a suite of trainings and resources to the out of education and youth work sector. So we have a designated or specified one-day training that we deliver to youth workers and other practitioners, and it's called Understanding Young People and Pornography. So that's a one-day information course, and it looks to define and explore the topic of pornography, then kind of explore the reasons why young people might engage with pornography, both positive and negative, and then to understand the impact of pornography on young people. And much of those we've already discussed at length today. So, but what it also does is provide a medium or a forum for workers to kind of have those open discussions that they're not able to or don't feel able to have in general day-to-day work. And then that allows them to kind of practice share, or at least hear that issues or concerns that they're having themselves are being kind of replicated in other areas as well through interaction with other workers. But the training is just one element. So we deliver other trainings then as well about, let's talk about consent. So again, pornography comes up strongly in that because consent is not explicit in pornography, and that creates an issue when young people are entering into sexual encounters around when consent is given and not, and the cues they've taken from watching pornography. We have a Before You Decide program. Again, that piece of eradicating regret of first sexual activity is a really important piece for young people. So that's the bit about equipping them with the skills around relationships and all of that, so that they're not put in a position where they are living with that regret and fallout of it. And then we work with organizations to develop sexual health policy. So that enables the organizations to work in a unified way in terms of addressing the issue of sexual health and doing it through best practice and making sure that everyone is working in the one way. And then just to finish up on what we have 2 e-learnings then on the youth.ie website, which are around sexual health promotion, and they provide a really reliable and fact-based approach to sexual health promotion and dealing with the topic of sexual health with our young people. So for any practitioners or parents that are thinking about initiating that conversation, they're a really useful resource in terms of just maybe if you want to do a little bit of upskilling in advance of that. And in terms of what we'd like to see happening on top of what's there is that openness to be able to discuss the piece so that young people, like post-COVID, I suppose there's this sense that people are in isolation and got ingrained in behaviours and that, and just being able to kind of feel free to discuss these topics and have that one trusted adult that they can go and have the conversation with. If it's not a parent, then it's a youth worker or someone in the community that's equipped to have those conversations with them. And that's ideally what we'd like to see for all young people in relation to that.
Great, thanks for that. And Mella, then if I can come to you, and again, you know, get a sense of what's happening through your organization. And if I was to sort of add a supplementary question here, how well equipped are teachers to deal with this? Presumably they're as uncomfortable as parents are in many ways, and, you know, maybe more so. So again, I'm just assuming that this is a really difficult area for them. So what are the supports, what can be done? And again, is there a lot more you'd like to see being done?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so I've mentioned that one learning outcome that's in the revised junior cycle SPHE curriculum. And so that's the only reference, it's the only time the word pornography appears in the junior cycle specification. And this leans very closely into what Moira was saying. It's not a case of just suddenly deciding that you're going to engage young people in a discussion about pornography. You know, that discussion needs to be interwoven with learning that is right across the new SPHE curriculum in terms of healthy relationships and consent and gender equality, social and cultural norms. So it's a much broader, almost pyramid that you're building as you're going through the 3 years of junior cycle. We know that particular learning outcome did attract some attention during the consultation on the draft specification, and then when the document was published. Some people were worried that if you mentioned pornography, that would kind of lead to a normalization of it. But actually, when you look at the words in that learning outcome, the intent is the very opposite. So the purpose of that learning outcome is really to open up a discussion with young people. And the key messages are around, you know, that we live in this increasingly sexualized world, that young people need to be equipped to decode or interrogate those messages and images that they're surrounded by often, and that it's normal to be curious about sex, but pornography is not the place to go for information about relationships and sexuality. It's not reflective of sex in the real world. It can be disturbing. And so, in fact, one of the key messages that we would like to go through in the teaching and learning around this area is that not watching pornography is a very healthy choice for young people. And then you were talking about, teachers and whether or not they're equipped to actually deal with this, because it is, as we've said already, potentially a sensitive issue. So the NCCA is aware of that. We've produced a guidance document for teachers on that specific learning outcome. And that document would identify very clearly what pre-learning is advisable for students and teachers to engage with before they come to learning outcome, which mentions pornography. So that's a really good example of how the integrated approach to relationships and sexuality, which is kind of a new approach in this latest curriculum document, is coming to the fore. So that means that, it's not relationships and sexuality as a separate set of standalone lessons. It's integrated right across the 3 years of the course. So in that guidance document for teachers, what we're saying is that students should have engaged with learning about their own self-identity, about empathy, about, gender equality, all those things that I mentioned earlier on, that should be happening before they come to a discussion about pornography, which if that is the path that's followed, then hopefully will take some of the sensitivity out of the issue for the teachers and for the students. So they're kind of teachers are gradually building student capacity to engage with that topic. And the other thing then is that guidance document, that specific one, is just one of a series of supports that's available on we have an online toolkit, SPHE toolkits. It's available on curriculumonline.ie. So other relevant supports that are there include guidance for teachers around dealing with sensitive or challenging discussions more generally, how to set up a safe SPHE classroom. And then the toolkit also houses a series of HSE resources that have been developed specifically to support teachers and students where the new 2023 junior cycle SPHE curriculum is concerned. And where the learning outcome that references pornography is concerned, the HSE, the Department of Education and the NCCA are working in partnership at the moment on developing a set of lessons that will include content around that particular learning outcome, and they should be available in the next academic year. Also important in terms of building teacher capacity, we've got a professional service for teachers called IDJA, and IDJA are using the NCCA's SPHE toolkits as the basis for their professional in-services for teachers. That's happening at the moment. The Department of Education is also funding a level 9 diploma on SPHE for teachers who want to, very specifically want to upskill on these new curriculum documents. But despite all of these really welcome initiatives, teachers, they really need substantial and ongoing continuous professional development and supports where these issues are concerned, because as we know, in our rapidly changing world, the issues are very nuanced. They change quite quickly, and teachers need to kind of keep up to speed in order to be able to deal with any sensitivities that might arise for their young people.
Great. Thanks for that. So, Moira, we're going to go back to you. Similar question. What's the HSE doing now? You've touched on this, but again, from your own perspective, what else would you like to see being done?
Well, you asked about, what's the ultimate vision? And the ultimate vision is about, enabling children to be happy and healthy, and enabling them to have the capacity to become happy, healthy, fulfilled adults. And it's really incumbent on us all. And, the fact that Kevin, Mella, myself, and all our colleagues, we don't work in isolation. We all work together. We work with Kevin, the NYCI, and some, wider youth work settings. We work with the Department of Education and the NCCA, and they with us. And, the ultimate vision is about bringing all these synergies together. I'm working with the ESRI and the research and our research department, bringing all that resource and energy to support young people to develop and grow in the best way they can. And obviously, one of our substantial focuses is on parents, because we do know that young people, they're getting lots of things thrown at them from right, left, and centre, some trustworthy, some non-trustworthy sources. And it's really important that, we start with the foundational piece with parents, supporting parents to understand the role, and I suppose to filter in youth, in the early years, to filter online access, just to kind of, be that barrier between young children and the world. But as they grow and mature, we have to support young people to become autonomous adults. And it is really important. Not only does the HSC obviously have resources around relationships and sexuality, but it also runs parenting courses. And some of this is around promoting what was very clear from the research is very important. A kind of a love and limits, an authoritative approach to parenting, not authoritarian, authoritative, where there's, as the research was telling us, there is that protective level of monitoring, where parents are very aware of what their children are doing, who their friendship groups are, what's going on in their lives, not in an intrusive or surveillance way, but more in that kind of supportive role. So, obviously, within the HSC, we want to promote this kind of broader approach to parenting, not just focused on relationships and sexuality, but with regard to this particular piece, we have developed just an acknowledgement that parents are just so important as the foundational, the primary educators of their children. We've developed a range of resources for parents called Making the Big Talk, Many Small Talks. It's a series of booklets that goes from the earliest years, 4 to 7, 8 to 12, and then 13 to 18. And 13 to 18 bit does actually talk about pornography and how to begin addressing it. And we would really promote and advocate the use of these resources, but also, other trusted resources to support parents to begin having these conversations and to connect in with their schools. As Mella's saying, there's a lot of developments going on in the whole kind of school community, and particularly with SPHE. So to connect in with what's going on with their schools and then complement and reinforce what's going on in schools in the home.
Great, thanks for that. I have to say, this is way out of my expertise, so I'm learning a huge amount today, and I have to say it's the sort of troubling finding. It's a troubling issue, but it's actually very heartening to listen to the three of you and to hear about the work that has been done, and more, as you said, the connections across the various groups and those sort of interactions. So I have to say, troubled on the one hand, but comforted on the other. Moira, your hand is up. You want
to just to say, if people listening want to look at the resources and the research, obviously the current research will be on the ESRI website, but also on sexualwellbeing.ie, on the section for parents and on the section for professionals. There are a lot of resources there that will be of use.
Great, thanks for that. So Anne and Emer, if you want to rejoin us at this point, and we've got about 10 minutes for questions, and we'll direct the questions primarily at the researchers, but if any of the other colleagues want to get involved in the discussion, you're more than welcome to do so. So the first question from an anonymous attendee: any evidence on people or young adults who were survivors of childhood sexual abuse and the use of pornography? So I don't know, Anne or Emer, you can just quickly, I don't know if you have data on such an issue.
Just the brief answer is there are no data on the issue in growing up in Ireland. There were ethical considerations around collecting that data when the legal advice at the time was that there was a reporting requirement. So we don't have that, but it would be worth exploring that in the future if at all possible.
Okay, thanks for that. Next then from Maria Otero Vasquez. So there's an appreciation for the seminar and discussion. Any data in relation to the type of pornography young people are accessing. And if I have a related question, I mean, is pornography defined in the questionnaire, and do we all know precisely what we're talking about? So Anne or Emer?
Yeah, I can take that. So no, we don't know anything about that in growing up in Ireland. So they were just asked, do you use the internet for various different purposes? And the simple label was pornography. So yeah, we've no idea of the types or, you know, how exactly they're accessing it. I suppose there's been a number of sort of consultations for other surveys that have delved into this issue and the sort of the difficulty in sort of capturing this information. So there's the national, I get the acronym wrong, but it's the NASAL surveys in the UK, which are sort of periodic surveys of sexual health and well-being. And the consultation for the next survey, so it's NATSAL 4, they've been discussing this issue about how, I suppose, people who answer these questionnaires perceive what's meant by pornography and whether sort of further information needs to be provided. So I think that the short answer to this is that it's really difficult to try and capture this. It's also really difficult to try and capture it in a study like Growing Up in Ireland, where we're not just focused on sexual health, we're also focused on the sort of the wider context and developmental sort of trajectories of young people. So yeah, I agree. It would be nice to know a little bit more about this, but we were constrained really when growing up in Ireland with the length of the questionnaire.
Okay, all very understandable. Another very interesting question from Aisling Murray. I think I know the answer here, but let's air the topic anyway. Question from Aisling: do you have any sources of information about pornography use amongst adults of parent age, both in terms of modeling behaviour, but also the extent to which parents might have informed conversations about the topic with their adolescent, young adult children? So I think there's a couple of dimensions to Aisling's question. I mean, one is essentially parallel research on adult use, but there is that interesting question then that presumably some adults may themselves be users of pornography. Parents will have different knowledge of you know what it is they're dealing with. So it's that. And again, Moira, you're very welcome to come in on this if you want, but it's not mandatory. But maybe to Anne and Emer first, that parent child young adult interaction. Yeah,
it's a great question, Aisling, but unfortunately there is no such information available on the adult population in Ireland. There is a planned new sexual health survey. I'm not sure whether that will be covered, but it certainly would be really interesting to cover that among the adult population, because you're right, you know, there could be a potential gap there between parents and young people about what types of porn are out there. But also we know there's already a digital divide, really, generationally as well. So parents may not be fully aware how easy it is to come across porn. And, you know, in order to have that informed conversation.
There are a couple of questions, Mella. I know the Q&A is primarily for the researcher, but there are one or two, and I'm guessing you might choose to have an opportunity to answer them. So let me just run one by Mella, if I may. So it's mentioned, Mella, that you discussed young people wanting to know where to go to get support if they're impacted by pornography, and the question is, where do they go? Okay, if they want to get support. And there is a follow-on question. When you mentioned young people seeking support, have they indicated what sort of supports they want? And do we really think they would engage with those supports? So there's a number of points there. I let you choose, you know, which to deal with, but it's that I thought you might want an opportunity to engage with the question, which I think is a good one.
Yeah, I guess that first question, it's not unrelated to teacher capacity as well, because for us in the curriculum world, there's a real connect between what's in the documents and then how it's actually translated in the classroom. So in terms of the discussion that might arise in the classroom, that kind of comes down partly to the capacity of the teachers to actually deal with it. And it's not also unrelated. Moira might want to come in here as well, to the capacity of parents to also support young people as they engage in these discussions. it's a kind of a wider societal thing, isn't it? That there needs to be a whole range of kind of supports that come into play. So it's the people in the young people's lives. I'm sure Kevin would mirror this as well. But it's also the information that's available for them. So Moira might want to talk a little bit about some of the HSE materials that are there.
I mean, absolutely, as you say, Mella. You know, I have to say I've used it a few times, so it's a bit of a cliche, but it does take a village to raise a child. You know. Those supports that those young people need can't come from any one sector. So it is, and I suppose for parents, you know, there's a school setting and there's the youth work setting, and they get to know the young person in a particular way, but the parent is going to be there from the beginning right through, you know, and be there and hopefully be available to the young person and know what else is going on in their lives. So it's just really important for parents to be supported, to have that open, ongoing conversation, and keep the channels of communication open, I should say, because it'll never be just about one conversation, and it'll never just be one upset or one difficulty or one. It is about that ongoing, supportive, foundational relationship with the young person, which then can be complemented by the support services in a school setting, you know, the counselling guidance service, which obviously is very supportive and available, and the support services within the youth sector.
Okay, thanks so much for that. We're really approaching the end of, we said we'd be done by 11:15, or 12:15 rather, and unfortunately there are an awful lot more questions, but it's not really going to be possible to deal with them, I'm afraid. So, I mean, I think the clear thing, and I think a couple of people touched on this in their remarks, it's really important we talk about this. Sometimes I do think ESRI research, the content of the research and the findings is really important, but the spawning of the conversation is an equally important function, that it gives us something to start debating and discussing and interacting with. And it's even been a great way to get over 100 people online today to start the conversation. So based on the number of questions we haven't answered, I think another session at some point is going to be required. So maybe we'll again talk to the HSE colleagues and the others on the call about developing this conversation a little bit further. So look, as I said, unfortunately we're going to have to leave it there, but I obviously want to thank Mella, Kevin and Moira for contributing in the way that they did. Also Orla, McGowan earlier on from the HSE for introducing the webinar. Emer and Anne, congratulations to you both for your participation, but a fantastic report that clearly is getting a huge amount of coverage, generating a huge amount of debate and discussion. A general thanks to the colleagues of the HSE for funding the work, and again for engaging with it. And thanks to the 100 souls who logged on today. We weren't sure, given we're on the eve of a bank holiday weekend, we weren't sure how many people would log on. But anyway, fantastic to see that so many did. So with that, I'm just going to wish you all a goodbye and enjoy the St. Patrick's weekend. Bye-bye.